Dear all, welcome to another Belgrade NATO Week, an international conference organized by Center for Euro-Atlantic Studies from Belgrade, CEAS. 8 years and 10 events in a row. Thank you for being with us in these almost impossible circumstances. 4 years ago, the speaker at our conference was Walter Slocum, then and now member of the board of directors of the influential American Atlantic Council. Mr. Slocum was, by the way, an advisor to the United States Secretary of Defense from 1994 to 2001, during a difficult period for the United States, NATO, the EU, and the Western Balkans. I remember well the phrase he used during his address. In light of somewhat unexpected results of the elections held in the United States of America. So here we are together again. A lot has changed in these last 4 years in Serbia, in the Balkans, America, and in the world, let alone in comparison with the 90s. In the last few years, CEAS has introduced the practice of designing and ordering special public opinion polls for our conferences, which was conducted together with CECID. Tomorrow, during the formal opening of this year's Belgrade NATO Week, we will officially launch the results of this year's survey under the title This Is Us. This research was finalized literally a few days ago. At this moment, 63% of Serbian citizens support stronger cooperation with the United States in the areas of economy, security, and defense as well, regardless of who is in the White House. Add to that 13% of the undecided who can probably be convinced by the proactive, well-argumented approach, and then that comes up to 80% of the citizens of Serbia. So this is also us, Serbia of the 2020. The situation was certainly not like this 4 years ago, so take this under consideration. I believe that we can see now that 63% of Serbian citizens strongly believe that attitudes of the United States towards Serbia is increasing and is getting much better than before. You will probably find it interesting to see the findings as which actors the Serbian citizens noticed as those promoting intensified pro-American rhetoric and which ones did not. In the same 4 years, due to the competition of the great powers in the Balkans and yet another attempt by the West to resolve the very complex issue of Kosovo, a huge number of reports on the region has been published again. However, there are very few in which this trend is mentioned, let alone analyzed in depth. It seems to us that this trend, which should be seen as a win-win situation for all, including NATO, and not just a zero-sum game in relation to Pristina, Sarajevo, Brussels, Berlin, parts of Washington, should be brushed aside and even obstructed. We fear that some of the means and reasons for doing so could lead to an erosion of the credibility of open society structures, especially its supposedly more liberal parts. And it seems that something similar is taking place in the United States as well, and generally speaking in Western international community. CEAS hopes that its work in the last 4 years has contributed at least by a small percentage to strengthening the support of Serbian citizens for cooperation with the United States, and we will not change anything regardless of the professional, organizational consequences and disappointments that have exhausted us almost to the end. Well, in the light of all these somewhat unexpected results and the new circumstances we live in, let us see what and how to proceed, to continue or not to continue. Of course, when it comes to us, we have no Hamlet's dilemmas when it comes to U.S. policy towards the region and Serbia, regardless of the ghosts of the 90s still wandering the halls. Thank you one more time. Dear panelists, dear guests with us, dear Elizabeth, the microphone is yours.
Thank you very much, Jelena. I hear an echo, but I'm assuming you can hear me fine. So thank you for having us. And you look very lonely there in your palace, but congratulations to you and your team for having put together a hybrid conference, which I know from experience is phenomenally more difficult than digital only, but so much more rewarding, because I think we've all done a lot of digital only, and we are waiting for the day when we can meet in person. So at least you are there to represent us all in the enormous palace, and we look forward to seeing you again next year. So I and the panel are here to discuss, I guess, as a sort of an early start to the conference, a phenomenal range of topics. So it's I feel like maybe we should have the whole conference to ourselves, but we've got 80 minutes, and in that time we'll cover, just to go through, as you have all seen the program, we'll go through recent developments in Southeast Europe, including Greece, Macedonia, Montenegro, North Macedonia. We'll talk about economic relations between Belgrade and Pristina and the so-called mini Schengen area, free movements of goods, people, service, and capital. And by the way, it was interesting. Just the other day, somebody was talking about a mini Schengen area, but said it in not in relation to this region, of course, but said it in such a way that it sounded like a mini Shenzhen, which is, of course, something completely different. And I think we don't want a mini Shenzhen, we want a mini Schengen. But we'll discuss that, and we'll discuss what should be the focus of in the Western Balkans in Southeast Europe, what is at stake in the EU, US, NATO cooperation in the area. Are agreements reached at the recently held Berlin Process Sofia summit? Are they a sign of more or less harmonization between EU policies in the region? So it's a phenomenal range of subjects. So what we'll do is give the floor first to Minister Chomic, who is to be congratulated on being part of a newly formed government, and we're incredibly pleased that you're able to be on this panel. So we'll start with you, and then the other speakers will follow in the order they are listed on the program. And in order to save time, I won't go through their very distinguished resumes. I think you will be familiar with them, and otherwise feel free to read up on the website where all the information is listed. But we'll start with Minister Chomic, and then go to the other speakers, and then we'll have a discussion afterwards. There won't be a Q&A function this time, but we'll make sure to make the conversation lively and cover all the questions you might have asked. So I'll try to anticipate which questions would have been asked. But with that, over to you, Minister. And I should say, apologies, I should say this session, and indeed all the sessions, are being translated in simultaneous translation. And I should also say that that all the information is available on the website, and you can also follow updates on Twitter. So with that, over to you, Minister.
Thank you. As brief as I can, I will try to picture the perspective from my personal capacity, but also the former position of the survey we read, of the event that took place the year that just is past, and the years before, and what can we expect to happen in the year to come. And because I deeply believe that there is no text without the context, then I will share with you from my personal capacity how I see the role of NATO in the region, and what can happen next. We live times that are changing, as Bob Dylan would say. And I think we can't talk about what has happened and what will happen with describing that the pandemic is the context that pushed us to change our behavior, and nothing will ever be the same as it was before the pandemic broke out. That's for sure. So NATO also will not be the same as it used to be before the pandemic. However, it may not sound connected at the moment, but everything changes and the role of NATO will change. And that is something what I would like to hear more about you when I share my perspective. First of all, the virus is nor gender blind nor gender neutral, and that is something what I'm concerned in Ministry of Human and Minority Rights and Social Dialogue, because more men die from virus and more work for women throughout the world are there because of the virus. How is that connected with NATO? I would see, if I would in your shoes and be someone who is influenced with NATO or working with NATO, I would think about the issue of going back to human rights as one side of coin of security for people. It's one coin, and the side of the human rights is forgotten and sold for security, to be blunt in a one sentence. Did region change because of the NATO as well as we changed because of the virus? It's not that I use virus as a metaphor for NATO. I'm just talking about the times that are changing. Yes, we have changed, and we have changed a lot. And what I will do as a minister is asking for Serbia for the benefit of the doubt, for the potential in Serbia to change, to follow the line that was started to be broadened with Partnership for Peace, but not just that, with cooperation and with a lot of things that we as a society have been doing in the years before. So the key events from the year 2020, as well said, was what has happened in North Macedonia, the agreements, what's going on between Belgrade and Pristina, and the change of administration in United States. Almost changed as I follow latest information. Well, again, from my personal capacity, my focus is on the fact that Kamala Harris is the first ever elected vice president. But nevertheless, I do not expect that USA will change anything in the policy that was clear. I also don't expect that Serbian people will change dramatically when they hear NATO. When they see NATO, they hear United States, and it's a kind of a very, very interesting relationship as far as I'm concerned, and much more similarities between what societies are trembling in United States and Serbia. What I would expect is that in the future, the role of the NATO be in the region as written, as conducted so far, but also broaden and also changed in that what I have shared. Pandemic changed us. People don't like to change. NATO doesn't like to change, but changes happen. And I think that the best thing for any society is to go towards the change. How can future cooperation with Serbia, between Serbia and NATO, be boosted or fostered with benefit of the doubt from the NATO that Serbia is here to stay, a very firm partner in Partnership for Peace, and Serbia is here to be critical when joining NATO as an organization is in question. And I think that there is a wide space for future cooperation. What I would also add at the end, that I think that should be of interest of NATO is that side of role of the women in peace processes, role of the women after COVID or during the COVID, and what can that mean for NATO, and how NATO can use a potential among very bright women in the region, and what can we from the region do in return. And one of the ideas that might influence even Berlin process is that my ministry will discuss with the committee in National Assembly the idea of if we can follow European spirit and European and USA cooperation with the borders and making people easy to walk without passports, etc. If we can follow European spirit in common infrastructural projects and railways and bridges and whatever, if we can follow European spirit in what is economical cooperation, the closed one, custom zones, etc., then my ministry thinks that we can follow European spirit as well in regional debate on human rights regionally. And I think that that would be the place for NATO to jump in and look at the coin that where security for the people are on the same coin, but the underside of human rights. We need human rights, not resilience, not just strategically. We really need human rights revisited. That's something what I deeply believe in. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It did occur to me that your title is it's probably not just your title, but your portfolio is. It would always be important, of course, but now more than ever, because we have seen in various countries how important societal cohesion is, and dialogue between different groups. Serbia obviously knows more about it than many of the other countries represented at this conference. But we have seen what can happen in countries, including the US, when societal cohesion disintegrates to a dangerous level, and it's not just a sort of a nice to watch phenomenon. It's a need to watch phenomenon, because if we don't, if we have this societal fragmentation, our countries are really at risk. So thank you very much, Minister. And you mentioned how in Serbia, NATO is seen as almost synonymous with the United States, which is a good opportunity for me to highlight the survey that Jelena mentioned a few minutes ago, a newly released survey, which has really quite interesting results. I'll go through them very quickly, and we'll build them into the discussion as well. So we are seeing in this survey that, for example, the question was asked, if referendum on Serbia's EU accession were to be held this week, how would you vote? And support for EU accession remains at pretty much the same level as it has been over the past 3 years. So at 50%, last year was 51%. Those saying they're against Serbia joining the EU next week, if it were to be possible, it's 36% against, up from 31% last year, but still significantly less than those who are in favor. And 14% would not vote. Then, if the EU were to become a supranational entity with binding defense policies, should Serbia abandon European integration, continue European integration? Or the third option was for people who don't know or won't say. And 29% of Serbs feel that if that were to happen, Serbia should abandon European integration. But 46% feel that Serbia should continue European integration, which I think is quite interesting. And 25% didn't have an opinion. Then going on to NATO, if a referendum on Serbia's joining NATO were to be held this week, how would you vote? 5% in favor, which is slightly less than last year at 9%. In 2018 was 11%, but still within the same trend. Those who are against, it was 80% in this most recent survey, up from 72% last year. And that's also pretty much part of the same trend, has been quite a significant figure. against NATO membership for a long time. 15% would not vote. And then, interestingly, to the best of your knowledge, how many EU member states are also NATO members? And so it's a question of knowledge rather than opinion. 31% thought that nearly all EU member states are also NATO members. 21% thought it was less than half of EU member states. And 10% thought it was less than 1/3. And then 35% didn't know. And then very quickly, what is your opinion of NATO as an international organization? 54% negative, 37% neutral, 6% positive. So that's very much, I guess, in line with what you said, Minister, and we can come back to that later. And then the very last question I'll go through here, so that we can continue with the discussion. What is your opinion on the current state of cooperation and partnership between Serbia and NATO? 33% said it was negative, 47% neutral, 14% positive, and 6% didn't know. So you've got your work cut out for you there, Minister, with quite a clear opinion, both with regards to the EU and to NATO. With that, we'll next turn to let's see who's next on my list. It's Damir Maris.
Can I add just a brief comment on surveys?
Yeah.
Of why do you have to love Serbia? When you ask people of Serbia what they think about Russia, well, they're very much in love with Russia for 60%. When they you ask them about United States or European Union, they are very critical. But when you ask them, where would you live if not Serbia? They say Frankfurt. And you ask, why not Russia? And they say, who would like to live in Russia? So we are actually in favor of what will be the inevitable future of Serbia. Sorry to interrupt.
No, but that's a very important point. And I think that's what it always comes down to. And people may rebel a bit. But yeah, when similar questions are asked in other countries, would you rather live in Russia, China, or the US? Virtually everybody wants to live in the US. But we'll come back to that, Minister. Now over to you, Damir.
Elizabeth, thank you very much. And Minister, thank you for your remarks. Just even to piggyback on that comment of yours, the statistic that really jumps out to me, I'm originally from Croatia. I live in the United States. I'm an American citizen now. The statistic that really jumps out for you for this is that the number of people in Serbia that are learning Russian is minuscule, and it's a Slavic language. Russian is actually not a very heavy lift. So that's another sort of just data point to build on your point there. So anyway, really thank you for having me. The subject of the panel is to continue or not. Provocative, obviously, the work will go on, and there will be more continuity, I think, than not. Minister, I take...
Damir, can I interrupt you? We're struggling to hear you a little bit. You're fading in and out at various points.
All right. Let me see. Is that better? Can you hear me? Yes? Okay. Well, so the work will go on. And I think the fact is that you're correct. I think that the virus presents an opportunity to sort of rethink many things. And that is a good thing, and I hope collectively we can take that opportunity and work together on a brighter future. I also want to, though, just use this as a moment to just talk about both continuities and disruptions. And I think that the right jumping off point for this is the legacy of Donald Trump. I want to say, first and foremost, I am not a Trump supporter at home. I'm not a Trumpist. I think that the way that Trump has approached European allies has been, on balance, more destructive than helpful. The kind of narrow-minded rhetorical brutality, I think, that he expressed towards allies just simply was not helpful. At the same time, I think that as the reality of President Trump's tenure recedes, we will see that the kind of disruption that he brought to both transatlantic relations, to American policy to the Balkans, but very, broadly, just in general, as a disruptor, it will be seen as significant, I would say. It's not that the caricature of Donald Trump, doesn't hold truths, but in many ways, I think it's a little overdrawn. There's an article, for example, in Bloomberg, just maybe 2 weeks before the election, that noted something that in the U.S. election then became borne out, that in fact the economy under Trump overperformed not just Obama's economy, because then you have all those questions about, but since 1996, it's some of the best numbers of growth in the United States. It's that there was a lot of disruption going on. A lot of it was unorthodox disruption, but disruption nonetheless. So again, real progress was made in the Balkans over the last 4 years. Some might argue that the Prespa Accords would have happened anyway. Some might even argue that they happened despite the Trump presidency. But I would say that again, I'm not sure that that's completely fair. If anything, it's Trump's disruption that really did bring, I think, Europeans and Americans together on a level that did not rise to the level of sort of the White House's attention. And there was a lot of cooperation on a level to really push and get that deal done. It really shows, in fact, which is another point I want to sort of end my remarks on, is the importance of US and European cooperation. Similarly, I think you'll find in Washington a lot of people, a lot of experts, Balkans experts, criticized Rick Grenell's approach to what was happening. Unorthodox, not grounded in an appreciation of the realities. And again, not false. None of these criticisms are false. And yet, at the same time, I think there have been very positive externalities to what has happened since then. Part of it, Elizabeth, I think, is reflected in the poll that you just mentioned. At least Serbian domestic opinion has shifted in the last 4 years because the United States has approached the issue in a completely different way. But it also shows, I think, another thing that's critical to understand about just general European policy and just the history of the Western Balkans since the end of the Cold War, and that is that U.S. leadership is important. And even U.S. leadership that is disruptive and focusing, let's say, on a much narrower set of priorities like improving trade relations, still, the United States is a prime mover, and the importance of U.S. engagement, I think, is the main takeaway that one can take from the Trump administration on this. So just a couple of words then on the Biden term. I do believe that people going into the Biden administration actually appreciate this fact, the fact and the importance and not the revelation, but the relearning of the lesson that American leadership is critical. And they will strive to do that. But of course, people doing the Balkans policy are not the only people in the Biden administration. Policy doesn't work that way. It's not that the specialists get to dictate everything. Balkans policy is a subset of broader transatlantic relations, broader relations with Europe. And so, the other thing that I think Ambassador Grenell's approach revealed is that the severe limitations of any U.S. leadership if the Europeans are not on board. That if there's a schism there, local leaders drive trucks through that, and actually less is achieved than could be. So I think the opportunity here is for the Biden administration to keep pushing and to work, with European leaders, hopefully building trust and coming up with a coherent policy that works together to move the ball forward on all sorts of things, all sorts of green shoots that I think are visible. The worry, however, is that Balkan policy will become, call it a victim of some kind of reset between the United States and its European allies. That, in fact, Washington decides that the lesson going forward is that, this is just something that the Europeans need to solve them by themselves. Leave it to Europe to do it. That's not going to work either. I think we've seen the lessons of that. There's some momentum here now. I think there's a real opportunity for it to be seized and pushed forward. And I look forward to discussing it with you going forward. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Damir. I hope that the sound improves. I think it may have, if it fades out every now and then, the reason may be that we have translators who are translating simultaneously and obviously have to use their mics. But that's fantastic service by the organizers. So I think we can all live with a little bit worse sound quality if it makes the interventions available to more people. So with that, over to Slavomir Debski, who I think is well known in the region and indeed other parts of Europe and across the pond. And as we all know, he is from the Polish Institute for International Affairs, but he has very helpfully set himself in front of the logo as well. But Slavomir, I don't think you needed to do that because you're well known in that capacity and as a long-term watcher of the region as well. So with that, over to you.
Oh, thank you very much, Elizabeth, and thank you very much for having me in this very, very important and timely organized event, I would say. Well, this background is sad because my private library is, as I said to Elizabeth before, I explained it, in intellectual disorder now, and it would took too much time to put it in the right way, all the books there. So without going too far into these technicalities, Damir said very interesting context of this discussion. So I would like to take his intervention as a point of departure. So let me start from the what we should expect from Biden administration and how it may impact Western Balkans and relationship between NATO and those countries who are who are not NATO members yet. My first point is that there are a lot of expectations from the Biden administration in Europe and around the world. I'm afraid that some of these expectations are going simply too far. So it may easily bring all of us into some delusion. Biden definitely brings all his legacy into the White House. So first, as a promoter of United States leadership based on alliances around the world. He's a powerful promoter and leader of process of Europe, making Europe whole and free, uniting Germany, enlarging NATO and European Union, promoter of democratic values and standards around the world. So if Damir said that under Trump administration, a lot was done in the Western Balkans. Most of the Western Balkan countries became members of NATO. One may say that it happened exactly because 30 years ago, Europe whole and free moment was put in motion. So even under, not particularly, let's say, not particularly, happy about NATO president, this process continued. So first, a challenge for the Biden administration and also for Europeans, for all NATO members, would be to enhance this moment, to prolong it, and perhaps introduce new institutional and policies and policy pillars to secure this, unifying moment, even during the bad times. The bad times may come. Damir said, and I fully agree, that however Trump has gone, but a lot of political potential of upheaval stayed in the United States. There are a lot of Trump voters who are not ready, not willing, not able to be connected to the outside world, to lead the democratic world, to be a leader in NATO. So this sentiment would stay with us. So I believe both Biden administration, Europeans, NATO should use this momentum. I don't know, maybe only 4 years we have now to find the ways how to promote NATO and transatlantic cooperation in the United States and also in Europe. This brings me to the question of Western Balkans. I had a lot of conversation with the politicians from various Western Balkan countries. And most of them were actually quite concerned by the lack of US leadership for some years. The message I heard from them was that, our doors to our cabinets have been open for all this time. But suddenly, in certain moments, nobody has been knocking. So when we heard that, we are a kind of, there is a kind of the struggle or competition on values, on interest, between the free world and China and Russia. The problem was that only the last diplomats, politicians, and messengers were ready to come and offer their agenda and wanted to work with us. So if we are talking about this, lack of leadership, which Biden administration puts quite high as a critical problem to solve, Western Balkans is quite a good illustration of the trouble, and it's because of that, it creates a kind of the opportunity for all of us to use generally Western Balkans as a defining issue for Biden administration. If they want to lead in the alliance, if they want to really lead in the free world, the Western Balkans is a quite good area to show this leadership, to bring Europeans together, and prolong this process of making Europe whole and free. And I would stop here, because I believe that however, from a very low level, sometimes we miss a lot of opportunities. But if we look at, or try to see the issue from the more strategic perspective, then we can really realize that, even these small things like, solving the problem of leadership in the Western Balkans, opening door policies both to NATO and to European Union, to enhance the message of the free world, Western Balkans can play the role. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Slawomir. And before I give the word to Bertram, all roads lead to Serbia, apparently. Yesterday, I finished George Packer's book about Richard Holbrooke, who, and I'm sure many of you, on the panel and on the call have read this book. And Richard Holbrooke comes across as a brilliant but often extremely difficult character. So I yesterday I emailed a friend who is a former US ambassador to Serbia and said, my impression of him is not so great after having read this book, and I won't tell you what he responded, but he responded just now. So to be continued, but on that note, over to Bertram, who may or may not have worked with Richard Holbrooke at the State Department. I'm not going to ask you to use your minutes for gossip, but for your perspective on the region.
Thank you very much. It is a great pleasure to be here today, at least via Zoom. As I just told Elizabeth, this is my first Zoom call ever, so I'm very proud of that as a retiree. I just want to thank Jelena.
Congratulations on having found the mute and unmute.
My daughter helped me. I really want to thank Jelena and her team at the Center for Euro-Atlantic Studies for hosting this conference, especially in such difficult times. I am proud and honored to be part of the tradition of NATO Week in Belgrade. I was in Belgrade last year, and it was a wonderful experience. So I'm very pleased that the center has continued this tradition. I'm also pleased that so many Serbian officials are participating this year, and I especially want to congratulate Minister Chomic for her new job and wish her the very best. I remember her well when I was in Belgrade in the early 2000s, and she was a very important voice of reason in the parliament and in the political scene back then even. And I look forward to a very interesting discussion and lively. I'm lucky because I'm retired, so I can say whatever I want. I have no masters, no audience. So for me, you'll hear my thoughts, honest and true. To address the question that was posed to this panel, I want to divide my talk into three parts. First, talk a little bit about the Trump administration the last 4 years, then talk about the outlook for the Biden administration, and then finish with sort of my recommendations for what the United States should be doing over the next 4 years in the Balkans. So first of all, Trump. Let's be honest, Trump was a disaster for America and for America's standing in the world. Fortunately, however, Trump was not a disaster for the Balkans. I would say, and again, I follow the Balkans pretty closely, and especially U.S. policy pretty closely, and I would say that U.S. policy towards the Balkans during the Trump administration was marked by continuity, considerable continuity. There were some differences in sort of attitude and style, but the core policies continued to be the same. Now, an important reason for that was, as Damir mentioned, that when Trump and his senior folks came in, they didn't know much about the Balkans. They didn't care much about the Balkans. So Balkan policy was largely left to senior professionals in the State Department. And we have excellent people there, people like Hoyt Yee, Matt Palmer, Phil Rieker, who know the Balkans inside out, who've spent years in the Balkans. And so the lack of interest was actually a good thing because it allowed for this continuity. To the degree that Trump and his senior folks did focus on the Balkans, their lack of knowledge was actually a positive thing because they didn't bring the biases of the 90s to that. So I would say for the first time, the US administration really treated Serbia as a normal country. Before that, Serbia was always a subject of pressure, of criticism. And for the first time, largely out of ignorance, I would say, the Trump administration treated Serbia as a normal country. And it was, for me, it was wonderful to see because I've always been advocating that. So that's good. And so I think this combination of lack of attention and a new sort of unbiased attitude was actually a positive thing and led to some positive outcomes. Damir already mentioned the Prespa agreement. There's North Macedonia and Montenegro's admission to NATO. Those were big steps forward. I also think that the Washington agreement, the White House agreements that were recently signed in September, are very significant and important. There was a lot of criticism, it was just for show, but really it symbolized a real positive interest in the region, and it sort of if it's implemented, which I hope that the Biden administration will implement everything that was agreed on our side and that the other parties also implement, it could have a significant benefit economically for the region, especially Serbia and Kosovo. And also, the Washington agreements are completely in line with the Europeans' emphasis on regional cooperation. So whether you call it mini Schengen or regional common market or whatever the term of art is right now, it's all the same direction. And so I think it fits nicely into that effect, even though it wasn't particularly well coordinated, just out of luck or happenstance, it fits nicely into the European policy. Of course, I would say a main failure of the Trump administration, as Damir pointed out, was the very poor cooperation with Europe at the highest levels. The rhetoric, but also the lack of interest, the lack of just person-to-person meetings was negative as far as the Balkan is concerned. My experience is that we're always more successful if the US and the EU are working together closely, are understanding what each other's doing, and are planning a sort of a joint approach and using our respective leverages to achieve that approach. So that is what I hope will be the case under the Biden administration. So first of all, I'd like to say Trump administration for the Balkans, not so bad, mostly good stuff. I hope the Biden administration will continue the positive attitude. We'll see how that goes, but I think they're sophisticated enough to understand that times have changed, that the Balkans of the 90s is no more the case today, that all the countries have changed. And Serbia, in many ways, has changed the most, really. I mean, especially in Gordana Čomić was part of that. The ouster of Milosevic was a regime change of enormous proportions and opened the way for really a new era of peace and stability in the Balkans. I would say overall, my expectation is that the Biden administration will also see a lot of continuity, both with what the Trump administration did, but also what the Obama administration did. So I think US policy will basically be continuous, and that's a good thing, with some adjustments. I also agree that US engagement is important, but as someone who has struggled with a lot of the mistakes the US has made, both in the Balkans and later in Afghanistan, it's only useful, important if it's done right. And by that, I mean in coordination with other actors and a positive attitude. So people that say the United States should be more engaged, careful what you wish for. I've seen that go very negatively for some places, including here in the Balkans, unfortunately. So again, I expect continuity. Biden is a big supporter of Euro-Atlantic cooperation. It's one of his key identities. He was always at the Munich conferences and knows all the leaders. I personally was control officer for his visit to Belgrade, where he met with Prime Minister Đinđić. And so he knows the region, he knows the European structures, and he is a big supporter of Euro-Atlantic cooperation. So I hope that the one big difference will be much better cooperation with Europe. I think for Serbia, it can have a very good relationship with the Biden administration if it continues a positive outreach and a sort of reasonable attitude. I think Serbia gets a lot of credit in Washington for just being normal and reasonable and being a stabilizing factor in these days in the Balkans. I look especially at Bosnia. I think Serbia does this enormous service by keeping things under control in regard to the Republika Srpska. The Vučić administration has taken a relatively sophisticated approach to Kosovo, which I welcome, and has worked well with Albania. So all these things I think are welcome in Washington. If those continue, I think the Vučić administration have a very good relationship with the new Biden administration. Needless to say, the Balkans will not be the top priority. And actually, that's kind of good news, because that's a sign of the progress of the stability here, as opposed to other regions of the world, the Middle East, Afghanistan, and so forth. So It won't be the top priority, but again, as Damir said, we have a lot of capable people. The working level will continue to do the policy, and they will get support from the higher levels as necessary. So let me turn now to recommendations. So first of all, as already mentioned, I think it's very important to have much, much closer coordination, cooperation with the EU on the Western Balkans. And I would go so far as to say that the US should really sit down with the EU and create a joint strategy. Our goal in the Balkans since 2000 has been European integration, Euro-Atlantic integration, EU integration. And if that's our goal, then we should put our energy into that and not have sort of separate initiatives and special deals and stuff. Let's focus on one plan and put it forward. You can imagine a basic deal whereby the Europeans would take the integration process more seriously, maybe accelerate it, strengthen it, and at the same time, the US would fully support that with its leverage and help them overcome some of the obstacles that have been delaying and standing in the way of integration. So I hope that happens. As an example, I think the US should continue to support the dialogue, the EU dialogue, and use its leverage to make that dialogue successful. And it's very important because the US has huge leverage in Kosovo and probably is the only country that can really get the Kosovo Albanians to sign up to a compromise deal. If we want a negotiated settlement, there's going to have to be compromise, and there's going to have to be some tough decisions made. And the US can help with that significantly. Also, I would say that strong support for regional integration. We've already seen the beginnings of that, support for mini Schengen, the Washington agreements, but I was very pleased by the conclusions at the Sofia summit on this regional common market and that approach. It should be made very clear that the regional integration is not a substitute for EU integration, but a part of it, and if done successfully, would actually accelerate the EU acceleration. That has to be an important message. And finally, I think we need to have continued strong support for international criminal justice, for the ICTY residual mechanism, for the specialist court, and for the domestic efforts on war crimes prosecution. This has been, in my opinion, a pretty successful effort, difficult, expensive, painful, but successful. And it's important to reconciliation and to creating a factual basis for the future to finish up all these war crimes efforts. I'd like to end with an observation. One of the things that frustrates me is that since 2000, everyone has known what the end state goal is, and everyone has agreed on it, which is EU integration for the whole of the Western Balkans. That's very different than other parts of the world. I don't know what the end state is in Afghanistan. I don't know what the end state is in Yemen or Syria, but I know what the end state is for the Balkans. So the question is merely, how do we accelerate implementation? How do we strengthen implementation on that? We've made good progress over the last 4 years, but it has to be faster. As I think Slavomir said, the expectations are high and have not been met. People here are losing hope because it keeps moving into the horizon. 10 years ago, to say you'll join in 10 years, okay, that's fair. Now to say you'll join in 10 years, it's 20 years, that's a long time. And so there really has to be a greater emphasis on showing, not just planning and doing, but also showing very visibly the opportunity and the benefits of EU integration. Some of you may remember the singer Jonathan Richman. He had a verse in one song said, "It's not enough to know it, I gotta see it." And people in the Balkans really need to see it. And it's a bit like a bicycle. If the bicycle's moving forward, it's stable. If it slows down, it starts to tip over. So to say, oh, slow down on that integration, but because you're unstable, is a little bit of a false approach. We want to accelerate the bicycle so it becomes more stable. Finally, no violence. One of the big mistakes we made at the beginning of the Balkan conflict was ignoring, allowing, not responding effectively to violence. And now we have to say absolutely to every party, no matter what's your grievance, no violence, not by state actors, not by paramilitary actors, no violence, because that can always slip out of control. In the Balkans, even though they have become more stable and making progress, they're still the countries are still fragile, and we have to avoid slipping backwards. So I'd like to stop there, and I'm happy to answer questions and give more thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bertram. And I should apologize. I blamed the translators earlier for the sound quality. It wasn't the translators at all. It was, I think, Damian's headphones. So the sound, I think, is coming across loud and clear now. And with that, we'll give the floor to Eric and then Ray after that. And then we'll have time for some questions. So if we speed up nicely, we'll have another round we'll have a round of questions. So over to you, Eric.
Great. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. And I'll try to be real quick, offering a few thoughts from Washington about what we should expect from the incoming Biden administration with regard to Europe, but specifically for the Western Balkans. And I think my remarks will very much echo what we've heard so far. I think we should expect no surprises. We know who Biden is. We've heard his track record, longstanding work on Europe dating back to his time in the Senate and as vice president. I think his main message to Europeans will be that America is back. Whether Europeans believe in that or not, that's the message that will be coming from Washington. You should expect that he will recommit the US to NATO, to Article 5, but also to the European project and the European Union and the notion and the vision of a Europe whole and free that traditionally has guided America's role in Europe dating back since after the Cold War. And Biden, of course, is deeply pro-European and a staunch Atlanticist. I think we should also expect him, and he's made that very clear, to voice support for multilateralism, for international agreements, international organizations, and also to shift the focus more towards issues related to values, such as democracy, rule of law. The minister mentioned human rights. I think, those are things that he, at least in principle, would like to focus more on in terms of US foreign policy. But aside from that, I also think another change will be in terms of the how US foreign policy is carried out. I think we should expect a return to a more normal, if you will, US foreign policy, a less maybe personality driven, maybe a less transactional US foreign policy. I think he will surround himself with very talented people, people who know Europe well, who will carry out more of a traditional decision-making process. So I think we should expect a more consistent, a more predictable, and a more transparent US foreign policy under a Biden administration. But of course, as was mentioned, there will be lots of other priorities on the agenda, both domestically, healing the deep divisions within the US. Elizabeth, you mentioned, cohesion. That's going to be a huge challenge for the incoming Biden administration to tackle the domestic issues in the United States. And then, of course, other foreign policy issues that will come up, be it in the Middle East, be it in Asia, be it elsewhere in Europe, that will take priority. So, despite all the good words and the change in tone and the change in the approach, I think it's still going to be a lot of challenges ahead of us. But what does this mean specifically for the Balkans? And here I agree with the previous speakers. I think there will actually be a lot of continuity between Biden and Trump. I think we should expect that Biden will continue to focus on trying to promote regional integration. He, of course, has a long track record also on the Balkans, dating back to the early 1990s. I think he will seek to restore U.S. leadership in the region, and he will very much seek to work with the Europeans on shaping a joint agenda. And I completely agree. I think that is really the key, and that has been the missing piece in the past 4 years. But that, of course, also puts the burden on the Europeans to step up and deliver and to be a willing and able partner with the U.S. I think we should expect, given Biden's emphasis on values, I think we should expect those issues related to democracy, rule of law, good governance to play a more important role in the U.S. approach towards the region as well, which I think would be welcome. So there will be a greater emphasis on that, promoting media, for instance. On the Serbia-Kosovo issue, I agree. I think there also will be a lot of continuity here. I think there's a recognition increasingly in Washington that, normalization and regional integration is really is necessary in order to achieve any broader regional improvements in terms of economic or political cooperations. I think we should expect a whole lot of continuity there as well, and focus on again, maybe not pursuing this through this kind of personality-driven and this kind of deals-making transactional approach, but rather through a sort of coordinated approach with the Europeans, trying to get them engaged on this process as well. Apart from that, I would also expect continuity in terms of the focus on issues like 5G, energy diversification, and connectivity and infrastructure. These are all issues that the Trump administration actually was pretty active on, including in this part of Europe. And I think we should actually expect a whole lot of continuity here from Biden. Perhaps the 3Cs initiative, that's a good example of work that the Trump administration has done, could also be extended perhaps to the Western Balkans, could put in additional resources. And this could also be a joint project between the US and Europe. So continuity, but again, maybe a slightly different approach, slightly different way of operating with Europe as a joint project on these issues. And then finally, I think he will put a lot of emphasis on great power competition in the region, especially the role of Russia, especially the role of China and other external players here. But I think the approach will be to try to basically improve structural reform, improve good governance, reduce corruption as a way to then counter these external actors that seek to exploit those conditions for their own gain. So I think these will also be elements of the approach. What does this, just to wrap up, where does this leave us? I think the notion that Damir mentioned about will the US take a back seat and let the Europeans lead? I hope that's not the case. I hope that the US will actually lead together with Europe. But as I alluded to earlier, that actually puts a lot of emphasis now in Europe. Biden will work with Brussels. He will work especially with Berlin. So I would love to hear from the other panelists what we should also expect from the Europeans and how willing they are to engage. It's not enough for them to be happy about a more positive tone in the transatlantic relationship. This will really be 4 years where we have to deliver and we have to be ambitious, and Europe cannot be complacent. And with an American administration that is more forward-leaning, that's easier to deal with, that has a more positive view of Europe, we cannot lose out on that opportunity and we must seize it. So that's what I really hope, and that's what I would love to hear additional thoughts on how we can really shape this joint transatlantic approach under a Biden administration.
Thank you, Eric. That's a perfect segue to Ray. I hope, unless you're going to make a completely different argument, but I think your thinking goes along similar lines. So I'll give you the floor, and then just to clarify, the questions will be asked by me. It's not a Q&A. We don't have a Q&A function on this panel, so I will have the great privilege of asking a round of questions after this.
Well, thanks very much, Elizabeth. It's great to be here again. I appreciate Yelena reaching out and making the invitation to join this important conference. And as my colleagues have done a great job of sort of setting up the background, I just want to associate myself with all that's already been brought forward. And some of the key points just that echoed in my mind, this no violence point, and just to think about how President Biden might approach things like K4 and U.S. involvement there. And it is, some of my colleagues already talked about, on a foreign policy front, many things I think that we see in motion now, although there might be different style, different approach, more technical approaches to foreign policy, I think what we're going to see is a lot of continuity. That's a lot of the discussion in the U.S. right now. More challenge at home, actually, for President Biden, because there is such a difference in the polity about some of the major domestic issues on the table. But I think abroad, many things will be similar or on the margins of what we've been doing. And the other key point that came out in this last, the last briefing or discussion was this sort of co-leadership. So in thinking about this discussion today, I tuned into a recent sort of European discussion on the margins of the Sofia summit. And basically, it was very interesting because there was not a single word mentioned about the U.S. effort on the normalization agreement with Kosovo and Serbia. So I think that's stood out, that there was a lot of silence on what the U.S. has been doing, and maybe because there was this fear of over criticizing with a new administration coming. But I think it's important, as my colleagues pointed out, that there was some significant positive outcomes of those discussions. I'm talking about the normalization discussions with Kosovo and Serbia, and the idea that we can focus on some other things now and not wrap ourselves around the history forever and exclude the European integration project that we're all supportive of. So I think that's an important thing. As I considered what President Biden might look at in the Balkans, as my colleagues have already said, a lot of experience, many visits to the region, a lot of discussions at his senatorial positions about what's happening in the Balkans. He was a supporter of the intervention in 1999, but he was also a very big supporter of protecting Serbian religious sites in Kosovo, for example. So I think he stands out as somebody who understands the region, as we've covered, and somebody who will not put it on the back burner, but will also want to partner multilaterally with the Europeans. And I kind of take that last discussion, this sort of co-leadership of what's going forward in the Balkans is very important. Because, again, as I listen to the European Commission enlargement chief, Mr. Varhelyi, talk about, he said the future of the whole region, when we talk about the Balkans, lies in the EU. And I actually agree with that, but at the same time, this idea of Western Euro-Atlantic integration and a partnership as we look at that. And I would actually put it in a reverse order a little bit too. When we think about the future of the whole region is in the hands of the EU, it's really in the hands of the people of the Balkans, this multi-ethnic, very complex mosaic of peoples. It's all in their hands, and the EU is really the sort of goal, this European integration, and the EU is ready to reach out the United States as a partner. So I think those are important. It's not just the EU offering a bunch of funding and projects, but EU holding to good governance standards and on down the line. So when we think about what is being discussed by the EU's three tracks, the EU has this three-track approach, this new enlargement methodology. Great to see, Albania and Macedonia back on the table for accession talks. And then which is part of the new methodology, and then this huge infrastructure investment funding. So with those kinds of efforts going forward, it's hard to see how the Balkans can even go backwards. With the momentum in these last 4 years, there's a lot of opportunity to keep that momentum. But the challenge is some of these other things that kind of hold things back. And when we talked about NATO earlier, we still have this huge challenge. It's not just Serbia, but it's about these non-recognizers of Kosovo that are part of NATO and the EU. And there's a certain point, if the EU is taking on this new approach and adding new momentum, I think the EU and NATO together need to relook at how they're approaching the recognition issue. Because without some progress from inside the Western Alliance to change these positions, I think we're still going to keep running into huge roadblocks and friction points. And with that, I want to leave two practical thoughts that, from my military background, that I think are important to put on the table. In the EU discussions, and so far in what I've seen from in the Balkan common market discussions and working together, I have not seen much in any of the programs about disaster response and preparedness. What I see here is a huge opportunity because we have three major players: the United States through the State Partner Program, the military program where we have a state assigned to each of the countries in the Balkans, the EU with its Emergency Response Coordination Center and its protection of and humanitarian operations programs, and then NATO with its Euro-Atlantic Disaster Response Center. And what happens is there's not synchronization among any of those, and certainly not with the Balkans. So low-hanging fruit, in my view, for closer Balkan integration among these other projects, the common market and so forth, is we have in our hands one of the major earthquake zones on the planet is right there centered in the Balkans. Yet because of this lack of cooperation at the military level, security level across these nations, we see that there's nobody really working together to glue all these opportunities. The EU has a great response system to reach out and help individual nations, but nobody's helping to build the resilience in these nations. So that is a huge opportunity. And I will add to that, the V4 is working to expand their capabilities in this area. And I think the V4 could be a facilitator and help the Western Balkans in this particular area. The V4 under the Polish presidency is actually taking new steps, particularly with medical readiness across borders to help prepare for the next pandemic. But not only, it's other sorts of natural and human disasters that can be addressed this way. So I would just say that there's a gap in how we're approaching disaster management, and there's a disaster on the horizon. The infrastructure, the medical system, response to refugees, all needs to be addressed, and I think woven in to this next era of European and American support and help to integration. And again, these non-recognizers, that's a huge stumbling block in any of this. But on disaster management, things could be done without getting through that barrier first. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ray. While I invite the speakers to comment on anything any of the other speakers have said, I'd like to ask a question while you are thinking to Minister Chomic. And it struck me when I first read your title that you're the only minister I know of who has the words social dialogue in your title. So again, Minister Chomic's full title is Minister for Human Rights and Human and Minority Rights and Social Dialogue. And even though it doesn't have to do, in this question doesn't have anything to do with foreign policy, I think this is an area where other countries could learn from Serbia, specifically on the issue of social dialogue. And the reason I ask it is, of course, that we have incredible social fragmentation in our countries, and international ideas. So the International Institute for Electoral Assistance recently released a report pointing to exactly this loss of social contract in countries where the social contract has been taken for granted. So, Minister, I was wondering if you can give us some insights on what the lack of what the decline of the social contract could lead to, and how to prevent that from having really dangerous effects on society.
The dialogue is a basic tool of democracy, and all of the developed and modern world used to know that and love for quite a lot of period of time. But I'm witnesses, and someone coming from Serbia for the last 30 years in politics, that the developed societies really do not appreciate that tool that is indispensable to resolve all the issues. And I feel sorry for that. I make jokes on my account sometimes, talking to my foreign friends, saying, I'm coming from your future. Don't do that. Cherish the dialogue. Because what we will do in ministry, and what has to be done in our society, but also in the region, is for the people to understand the concept of the dialogue. It means that at least two people who can't stand each other, who would rather be on some other planet, not in the room with the person you can't stand, but you enter the room and you give him the benefit of the doubt, because you are not gossiping the problems or him. You are talking about the issue that people that you work for are concerned about. We do not understand the concept of dialogue. We never had that. We did, but like sparklers in society. And this ministry, with that dialogue unit, will enable space for whoever to talk about whatever with someone that is in charge. And there must be some productive thing coming out of this. If you despise the dialogue, if you negatively define the other person for any reason, everybody is losing. And because of the lack of the dialogue, we lost 30 years of our lives in Balkans with the politicians who are time eaters. What the dialogue should produce are politicians that are time builders. We need time building in this region. And I think that all of people around here and in our debate or throughout Europe or throughout the United States, there are people who are time builders. We need people who are brave enough to talk to someone they hate about the things that may build better time for everybody. That's the job for the ministry. Easy one. You can take it.
Well, yeah, that sounds like a walk in the park. Thank you very much, Minister. It's so important to think about what you just said, that the social fragmentation isn't inevitable, and in fact it can be prevented. And the only effect of social fragmentation is that it loses. It wastes time for the country that the country then has to make up for. And I think we have seen in a lot of Western European countries that dialogue has been taken for granted. In other words, that you don't have to engage in it. And we are seeing the results of that incredible animosity between different groups. I'm keen to let Damir come back in, and hopefully we'll hear him perfectly this time. So Damir, feel free to give us a minute on anything you've heard so far, and then you'll be followed by Slavomir.
Okay, how's this? Testing. Elizabeth, can you hear me? Better? Okay, great. So one question I'd love to hear from the rest of the panel, which I think is critical. Eric, you asked, questions of the Europeans and what kind of, what perhaps needs to be asked. I think one of the interesting things, I think, Ray, you mentioned that the new accession protocol is a hopeful sign, and I think it is. But at the same time, what needs to happen, I think now, is that Europeans stop talking in that sort of almost end of history deterministic way about European expansion. I think we need to be realistic, especially in the Western Balkans, about what the new protocol means, what the new political realities in Europe mean for European expansion, and what the time frames are. This is why I would say that the Berlin process and the Sofia summit actually were a very hopeful thing. And I think that one important thing that Europeans should do, especially on the European level in Brussels, is to embrace this, is to embrace the local leadership for this European integration. Of course, none of this is an alternative to European integration, but that doesn't mean that European integration is in a particularly good place right now, that we're in a healthy place together. And while it's not an alternative, I think it needs to also not just be something that's happening on the side. It needs to be, I think, taken very seriously and a lot of energy put into it, because I think that there's actually a lot of space for momentum there, whereas the European process will be long and torturous at this point. So I'd just like to throw that out to my colleagues.
Thank you. And we'll pass the baton to Slavomir for 60 seconds or so.
Yes, I think that it's good to explain better what I mean by introducing new impetus and U.S. leadership into our transatlantic community. I believe we need to focus on open door policies and send the message that what we really mean by open door policy. I believe that, after all these waves of enlargements of both NATO and the EU, we reach the point when we most often talk about the end of the enlargement, the end of the process of making Europe whole and free, which actually undermines aspirations of the nations, which are left, in our close proximity out of these institutions. In that way, we undermine also the power of the free world, because if democratic societies, if nations want to become members of institutional manifestations of the free world, and we shut the doors to this institution out, leaving them aside, then it sends a very strong negative message about the free world, that it's about exclusion, not inclusion of democratic powers. So I believe Biden administration and those Europeans who really believe that both those to the EU and NATO should be open for all as aspiring nations, should work together to enhance this particular element of the policy. Thank you.
Thank you, Savin. Over to Eric.
Thank you. I just wanted to add one point, which is on this notion of what Europe can offer. Obviously, Brussels and the EU will play a key role, but I would also look very carefully at Berlin. I think Biden will prioritize setting the relationship with Germany right, which is, of course, the bilateral relationship and the transatlantic relationship that's been hurt the most. And I think Berlin obviously will go through picking a new leader, having elections. There will be this political process, but I hope that at the end of the day, that Germany can help shape, a vision for Europe that is that brings together a stronger Europe with a stronger transatlantic link, and use that towards the Western Balkans as well in a way that's positive for the region, that provides leadership from Europe. Because I do think you need the big member states. Obviously, France has the EU presidency in 2022, but I think having Berlin more actively involved in the Western Balkans would be a very good thing. And there, I think actually Biden is an opportunity to work with Berlin and try to shape this joint approach that we're talking about together with Germany, as well as other European capitals and the EU. The last point, I just wanted to make, one thing you didn't mention from the survey, Elizabeth, that I found interesting was that it seems like the Serbian views of the United States are far more positive than the Serbian views of NATO. So I thought that was very interesting, and I hope that will continue to improve under a Biden administration and could perhaps over time also spill over onto positive views of NATO. So I just thought that distinction was quite interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. And yes, I'll just read that out. Actually, I'll let Ray go first, and then I'll read that out so that you don't have to wait for me to find the figures. So over to you, Ray.
Okay. I think I'd just like to add to this idea, this thought that really for Europe, this is an opportunity. Of course, it's an opportunity to heal the transatlantic relationship as much as I don't see it as a broken thing, but I see it as has had some definitely some speed bumps come up in this last administration. So with that, and talking about important partners, whether it's Berlin or Paris, I would also just like to note, Poland being invited by Germany to lead the Berlin process in this last year was, in my view, very significant. There's a lot of internal challenges within the EU, looking towards the East and considering what is, domestic issues, for example, in Poland or Hungary, or where the EU wants to step in and challenge current governments and so forth on various things that have to do with rule of law. So Poland finds itself in that position right now, but I think in opportunities to work on common challenges in the Balkans and help move forward an important relationship with Warsaw and Berlin, and then perhaps even to the Weimar Triangle, working more closely together. Again, Poland, the only Central Eastern Europe nation to lead the Berlin process. I thought it was significant. And I think Poland has a significant bilateral potential also with some of these important states, particularly with Serbia and Kosovo. Poland has some great potential bilaterally to be more involved with both the mission presence, embassy presence, and relationships in that sense to help from within foster the dynamic of further European integration for these nations.
Thank you, Ray. And I'll just give you these figures here, a couple of them. Are you in favor of closer cooperation with the USA in areas of economy, security, defense, regardless of which administration is in office in the United States? So that figure was 65% support, up from 63 in June. Only 18% oppose it. And then have you noticed that pro-American rhetoric has intensified in Serbia over the past year? And if so, where? And very interesting, very high figures here. Yes, has increased in civil sector, 96%. Yes, has increased among opposition politicians, 95%. Yes, among government politicians, 80%. Yes, on social media, 93%. Yes, in the media, 73%. So clearly there's potential to build on those really very high figures. Our time is up, so I'll thank the panelists here for really phenomenal insights on a range of issues. And I must say, this is a good reminder that retired diplomats are a fantastic source of information, not just because of what they know, but because of what they can say, having retired. So thank you, Bertram, and thank you to our think tank friends Slavomir, Eric, and Damir, and Ray, and of course to Minister Chomic, and to the government for hosting this conference for those who are able to attend in the presidential palace, and for the rest of us here on Zoom. And I think Jelena may want to come in again. I'm looking over at her now. Okay, so she's not coming in again. We'll instead wave at you, Jelena, and say thank you very much to you and to the other organizers, and good luck with the rest of the conference.
Jelena is coming in.
Okay, she's coming in.
No, it's okay. It was really a pleasure to listen to all of you. Great panel, some great insights and good recommendations. Hvala vam što ste se zaista potrudili.
Thank you for giving your utmost effort with all these brilliant contributions. We will forward you YouTube video of this panel, and we are continuing with the next session of our conference tomorrow, 3 p.m.